Last week we kicked off our sermon series, The Big Miracle, and we began looking at the biggest miracle, I believe, the biggest miracle, of how God can bring life from death. And we determined that if the Bible is full of eyewitnesses accounts of God defying the laws of this universe and making the impossible possible, that it is true that God can do the same thing for our lives as well. And today we're going to look at one of what I believe is not the biggest, but the most famous miracle. But I need you to do me a huge favor. When we start and we begin to go through this story is so famous and so familiar, you are going to want to, in your mind, jump to the end. Because you know how it ends. But please don't. I know it's hard, but don't rush to the end, because hidden in the middle of this big miracle are some concepts that is relevant and important for our lives today. And that is crisis. We miss the crisis if we jump to the end. And crisis is not optional in our lives today. Truth of the matter is, crisis is unavoidable. It's prevalent. And it's just part of the life that we live. And when it comes to crisis in our lives, we tend to view that all crises in our life are bad. And I don't mean to insinuate here that crisis is fun. I don't mean to say that God causes crisis to happen. But what if crisis in our lives were not all bad? What if God has a greater purpose that can come out of our crisis? And today we visit the Israelites as they are on their way to their big miracle. And we find them in the middle of a huge crisis. And crisis is often our path to God's big miracle for us. So let me fill you in on some background like I did with the children. 400 years the children of Israel have been slaves to Egypt. God sends his servant Moses to deliver the people out of Egypt. God did some plagues and some really bad stuff to the Egyptian people. So Pharaoh said, look, it's not worth it anymore. Just go. Just go. Go. Get out of here. And so the people of God, the Israelites, are thinking, yes, we are free, yes. And here in the 13th chapter of Exodus, beginning with the 17th verse, is where we pick up the story. And as we grow through this story, we're going to jump through. We're not going to go through the whole thing, but follow along in your Bibles. But I believe there's 8 principles. There's 8 things in here, and I know 8 sounds a lot, but we'll go through them fast. There are 8 things or concepts in this story that will help us on our path to the big miracle God has for us. So join me in Exodus 13, verse 17. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though it was short. It brings us to our first concept that the path to the big miracle that God has for our life is never on the short path or the easy road. God led them out of Egypt, even though it was not the easy road. And when we begin to move in God's direction in our life, trial and battle and conflict will accompany it. Our crisis will accompany it on that road. Listen, it doesn't mean that we're headed in the wrong direction. It doesn't mean that God is not with us every step that we take. It simply means God moves us towards our big miracle. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be the easy road. We hear sometimes and we think, okay, go. And we think, okay, God is in this. We're like, it's going to be just easy. We're going to ease on down the road. But God chose to take them down the easy road. Not down the easy road, but down the hard road. And let us continue and we see why. God says, continue in 17. For God said, if they face war, they may change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led his people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. It brings us to the second point. Sometimes the path to our big miracle in our life often takes us, not down the easy path, but it often takes us to a desert season or a dry season. You see, God was leading, delivering them from the big miracle, but they had to go through a desert or a dry season. And some of us right now are walking through a dry season in our life. We're in a dry place in our life. And you're saying, God, I thought you were in this. I thought you were with us. We're saying, God, I thought this was your plan for us. You're saying, God, I am doing what you asked. So God, why do I feel all alone right now? And here's why. God says, I had to take you through the desert season because you were not strong enough for war yet. I mean, think about it. The Israelites were newly freed slaves. They were not highly trained warriors. They would have got slaughtered. And God says, and while we're cussing the desert or the dry place we're in, God is saying, look, I'm protecting you from which that will kill you. The path to the big miracle leads us through a dry place. Let us continue with verse 20. After leaving Sukkoth, they camped near Etham on the edge of the desert. By day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. Our third point is when we move in the direction of the big miracle, God always moves in front of us. Imagine for a moment this morning being a child of Israel. I mean, you can see God in the clouds by day, and at night you can see God in this pillar of fire that was leading you, that was going out in front of you. How awesome would that be to see, visually see the presence of God each and every day in your life? But see, there's a trick, not a trick, but there's a point here. But see, because the Israelites had to see, they had to understand that the cloud and fire, they had to see it for what it was. I mean, it was the holy presence of God. It was not just, oh, it's looking stormy outside, or, oh, that's a bright star in the sky. No, they had to see it as the presence of God. And if you ever wondered in your life and what it might look like, what it looks like in a dark cloud, what might look like something that is about to burn you up in your life, have you ever thought about it that it just may be the presence of God going in front of you? We skip down to the 14th chapter of Exodus, beginning with the first verse. The Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to turn back and camp near Pi-Hahiroth and by Gilgal, by the sea. They are to encamp by the sea, directly opposite Baal-Zephon. Those are big words, but it comes us to our fourth point. And I want you to understand this, that on the path to the big miracle in life, we're often thrown a curveball. What's going on right now is basically this. There are a million people running away from slavery, running away to be free. They're following God in the cloud and the fire. And God says to Moses, when you look at the geography, God says, okay, now I want you to go back. What? God says to Moses, I want you to go back, and I want you to camp between the Red Sea and Madal, the city of Madal. The word Madal literally means elevated stage or tower wall. Meaning, it was a city upon a huge wall, a huge cliff. So the people had this huge wall on one side, you had the Red Sea on the other, and God literally backed a million people, the Israelites, into a corner. Why? Continue with verse 3. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around in the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. And God said, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So the Israelites did this. You see, God was setting this up so no one person, no one group of people could take credit for what God was fixing to do, for the big miracle that God was fixing to do. God was backing them into a corner on their way to the big miracle. He was putting them into a position where no one could say, hey, look what we did. Where one person, Moses says, look, I had this great strategy. I backed this into a wall. We got water in the cliff. No. God put them in the position where no one could say it was them. God put them in a position where only God could perform the big miracle. Verse 10. And as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. You have water on one side, rock tower on the other. Here comes Pharaoh's army of highly trained warriors. This leads us to number 5. The path to the big miracle always has a breaking point. It always has a breaking point. Isn't there always that moment in your life when you say, I'm done. I am done. I want out of this. I'm finally on the path to freedom. We were all backed into a corner. Here comes the warriors. I mean, come on. I mean, we've all been there, haven't we, in our life? And this is what they say to Moses, verse 13. They say to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, look, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die out here in the desert. And Moses answered to the people, or don't be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance that the Lord will bring to you today. The Egyptians you will see today, you will never see. What you will see today, you will never see again. Verse 14. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. So the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. All right. Confusion alert right here. If you read this again, what's going on? First God says to be still, and then God says to move. God says to be still, God says to move. God, what is God confused in this moment? What do you want them to do? Is God confused? No. When God says be still, He's speaking about their mouths and their heads, their minds. God says, some of you who are facing crisis, be still. Stop talking. God says, stop talking about your crisis to people who can't do anything about it. You're wasting yourself. You're wearing yourself out. You're letting your mind run and run and run with the what ifs. You're playing this what if game in your mouth, in your mind, and you're running your mouth looking for, talking about your problems everywhere, and you're going nowhere. You're going nowhere. God says, stop talking. Because some of us have been talking our way out of the miracle that God is trying to bring into our lives. Some of us have got to stop moving our mouths and our minds and move our feet in the direction that God wants us to move. And God says to Moses in verse 16, He says, raise your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the waters so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. Brings us to number 6. On our path to our big miracle, God always shows up in uncommon ways in our crisis. Here's a plan. God had a plan. Look, don't rush to the end on me here. This is where you want to rush to the end. You got to stay with me here. Imagine being Moses. What are we going to do, God? God to Moses. Moses, I want you to take your staff. I want you to point it at the water, and I'm going to part the water. You're going to walk through on dry land. You're going to do what? Moses, stretch out your hand. again and watch. Imagine again. You've got rock tower, you've got water, you've got army. You've got rock tower, you've got water, you've got army. God chooses water. Moses sees this water. And he sees what we're going through in our daily lives, and God shows up in uncommon ways in the midst of our crisis. On our path to our big miracle, we may be backed in the corner. We may feel like there's no way out. We may feel trapped on the inside and out. But be ready, because God is about to show up and show us in an uncommon way what He can do in our life. Verse 19. Then the angel of God had been traveling in front of Israel's army. Don't jump to the end on me. Withdrew and went behind him. The pillar of cloud also moved from in the front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to the one side and the light to the other, so neither went near the other all night long. Here's what happens. Don't jump to the end. Here's what happens. When Moses did exactly, however bizarre it may seem to Moses' mind, when God did it, Moses did exactly what God told him, instructed him to do. The angel that was leading them moved from the front of the Israelite people to the back. God literally put a smoke screen between them and the army that was pursuing him. God put a light up front so that they could see the path and light up the path to the way they were going. Did you get this? You got a smoke screen in back. You got a flashlight in front to light the path. I mean, in whatever you are facing in your life, you've got to know that the presence of God has the ability to position Himself between you and your enemy. Let that soak in for a moment. You in whatever it is that's trying to destroy you. You in whatever it is that's trying to destroy your relationships. Whatever it is, God can position, or will position Himself to make a smoke screen to confuse them, and at the same time providing a light for you in your path to move forward and away from it. That is good news. Verse 21. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all the night the Lord drove the sea back with the strongest east wind and turned it into dry land. It's not only did they go through, they went through all dry, they didn't get mud on their shoes. That's not in there. I just see if y'all pay attention. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, and the wall of water on their right, and a wall of water on their left. It brings us to our seventh point. When we're moving towards the big miracle that God has in front of us, in the middle of our crisis, God will always provide a way. Here's where we can finally jump to. You know the story. Pharaoh's army gets stuck in the mud. The Israelites walk on through. Remember, they walk through on dry land. When they bring their chariots and their horses, you can read it later. When they bring their chariots and horses through, guess what? They get stuck in mud. There's preaching there somewhere, but I'll lay that another day. Pharaoh's army gets stuck in the mud. The Israelites walk on through on dry land. They get on the other side. They're safe on the other side. Moses does this thing with the staff again. The waters close up. They drown the army. And 1 million Israelites are safe on the other side. God came through. God came through. Moments ago, there was water on one side, an army on the other, and a wall on the other. And in the midst of it, in the midst of their crisis, in the midst when they thought they were done, God came through. God made a way, and the wall collapsed on the Egyptians. God won. You get that? God and His people won. Exodus 31, chapter 14, 31. Brings us to our last point. The Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians. They feared the Lord and put their trust in Him and in Moses, His servant. the last and most final thing, if you didn't write down any of the 7, write down this last one. The result of the big miracle in our life is always greater trust. The result of the big miracle in our life is always greater trust. If you know someone in your life who totally, unequivocally, undeniably, unselfishly trusts God, I will guarantee you, if you know someone like that, I will guarantee you, if you sit down and begin to talk with them, you will find out that they have been through some horrible crisis in their life. I guarantee it. They have been through some incredible, terrifying stuff in their life. And God came through. For the people of Israel, God came through. In our crisis, we trust that God has us. We invite God to come and touch us. And if that's you, invite God to come and touch you. If you're in the middle of a crisis today, where is God? God is in our dry season you're going through. Is it an easy path? No, it's not an easy path. Life isn't easy. And maybe you feel like life is bearing down on you and you have no options. Maybe you feel trapped between a rock tower and water. Maybe you're in a place on your journey where you begin to give up hope. If that's you, we serve a God of hope. We serve a God who has a path already for us. We serve and worship a God of big miracles. In that moment when you feel like giving up, God will show you and show up and show you in the most uncommon way possible. Because we serve a God of big miracles. And He has a miracle for you as well. You pray with me.